Hey guys, I'm going to go over some watercolor tips to get started. I'm just going to talk about watercolor itself and how we use a palette like this and any other watercolor really that has cakes. So when you get watercolors, there's two different kind of watercolor you can get. You can get one that a set like this that has watercolor cakes, or you can get liquid watercolor. So let's in either way, if you did get liquid watercolor, you can do the same thing as you do with watercolor cakes, but I'll kind of go through that. So a few tips. The number one rule to watercolor is to have really clean water. So one way to keep it clean is to have 2 cups of water. So I have this is going to be my dirty, this is going to be my clean. So every time I use water into my watercolor, I'm going to use the clean water, the clean water to do it. And then I'm going to rinse off my brush with the dirty water. So I'll have both those there. Okay. It is, oops. Making some noise over here. So in order to make a wash, so when we're talking about watercolors, you'll very often hear people refer to creating a wash or apply a wash. So how you do that? Many times when people are using watercolor, they think that they go right into the cake, they put water in there, and they take the color and put it right on their paper. Not so. Okay, we're actually going to use the palette back here. This is actually a palette. A palette is where you keep paint. So I'm going to take some clean water, and I'm going to use green because green's my favorite color. I will tell you that. That's probably why I go to green first. So I'm going to use some green. I'm going to put the pigment right here. Okay, I'm going to put a little bit more of that pigment into the palette. Okay, I'm going to get more clean water. So what I'm going to do is clean my brush off in the dirty water. Wipe my brush off a little bit on the side of the dish before I go to the clean water. And now I'm going to start adding more water to this paint back here. As you can see, it's starting to thin out a lot more, and that's what gives it the consistency of watercolor. Okay, so I can, changing the opacity of the paint is what gives you the lighter color. Leaving it more pigment will give you a darker color, and that's how you change the value in watercolor. Okay. So I'm going to put a little bit more water in there. Okay, so now I've created my first wash. I'm never going to take color directly from the cake and put it right on my paper. That's a no-no. I want to create a more transparent color, so by adding water to it. I can also add a different color to it to change the type of color I want. So let's say that I wanted a yellow-green. So I'm going to take my paintbrush, I'm putting it in the dirty water again, wiping it on the side of the cup, getting clean water. I'm going to the yellow. Notice that because I went to I cleaned it off in the dirty water first, and then I went to the clean water, that I did not get any green in my yellow. Okay, so now I'm going to take that yellow and mix it into the green, and now I'm getting a yellow-green. Okay, so this is a good way to mix your colors. So if you did get liquid watercolor, you would put the pigment out onto your palette. You would add water to it to get more of a liquid, more of a fluid liquid onto your palette and make it more watercolor-like. Okay, so I've divided my paper into 8 sections, into transparency, flat wash, graded wash, wet on wet, dry brush, lift off, pen and ink, and masking with tape. You'll find this in the worksheet. You can read along and also watch the video as you are doing this. Please label your boxes just like I did for your assignment. Also, if you don't have masking tape, don't worry about it. Don't do it. Just skip it. But I wanted to show you so you know that that is an option. Okay, so I am now going to go through these steps for. Okay, for transparency, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a couple shapes with a lighter color first. And they don't have to be perfect. I'm just going to use this green-yellow, the yellow-green that I mixed up before. So I'm just going to do a quick triangle shape there. And then I'm going to do a quick rectangle shape here. I'm going to make sure I get more pigment. And so for this demo, I'm actually using drawing paper. It's a thicker drawing paper, which is okay. It will hold up pretty well. But watercolor paper is the best, but I didn't want you guys to have to go out and buy more paper. Okay, so I'm going to let those shapes dry, and I'm going to move on to the flat wash, and then we're going to come back to see how the transparency works. So for the flat wash, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a new color. I'm going to do a red-orange. So I am going to move my palette over so you guys can see it. So I'm going to get some red in there. Okay, I'm using the dirty water before I add more clean water, and you'll be super surprised by doing that, by having the dirty and clean water, how long your clean water will stay clean. I'm always shocked by that. As long as you remember to dip your brush into the dirty and then into the clean water, it will keep it nice and clean, and so you don't have to refill your water too much. Okay, so I'm just gonna, a flat wash means that there's not gonna be any gradation to it, there's not gonna be any transparency to it, so I'm just gonna straight up go right onto my paper with an even wash. Okay, and the more I keep my paintbrush with pigment, the more consistent my paint will be. If I put more paint on it, it's going to make it just a little bit darker, so I want to make sure that it is an even wash all the way around. Okay, so now I'm going to do a graded wash. Okay, so with the graded wash, I'm going to be using the color of your choice. You can use whatever color you want. And you're going to gradually change the value of your color by adding water to lighten the pigment. So I kind of already used up all this red yellow, but I'm going to, this red orange, oh my, this red orange, but I'm going to mix some more up. So again, into the dirty water with clean water. Put more red there. I'm going to make this a little bit more red than I did before. I really want mine to look different than the flat wash. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to just put a little bit of orange in there just to change it a little bit from the original color. So I'm going to start by adding my wash down just like this, and then I'm going to add more water to the wash itself to lighten it. So this is how we're going to create value. I'm going to put a little bit more water, and remember, every time you go back for more water, use that dirty water first to clean it. And then I'm going to just use my brush to smooth out that edge that's there. Okay, and then I'm going to gradually keep adding water to lighten it. Okay. And you will see as you are doing this, it will get lighter. And I can go back over the area that I already painted to smooth out that line so it's not so harsh. And then if you're finding that it's not going at the rate you want it to get lighter faster, it's a lot easier if I left a space close to it. But I can always take some of this, put it in another area, add some more water to it, and that's a much faster way of making it lighter. See how fast that made it lighter. Okay, so I can continue to use my paintbrush to go back over those areas to make it not such a harsh line. See how it's smoothing it out? It looks like a gradual change to a light red. And that's a graded wash. Okay, so wet on wet. We're going to apply clean water to this first, to the paper first. So I'm going to clean off my brush in that dirty water first. And then I'm going to use clean water. And I'm going to saturate the paper. So I'm going to get that nice and wet. So this is the wet on wet technique. Okay, so now I'm going to use this blue that I created over here, and I'm going to go right over that wet paper. And what you'll see, the difference between these two, it's a lot softer. This is usually how you make clouds, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. You'll see a worksheet on what techniques to use for which. And then, so what you'll see is it's a lot softer. The color just spreads out a lot more, unlike the flat wash. Okay, so I'm going to move up my paper here so you can see that, and you can still see the palette. So now we're going to do a dry brush, and the dry brush is kind of like the flat wash, because we're going to, I'm going to make a pigment, and then I'm going to completely dry my brush, okay? I'm going to make it so there's no moisture in my brush before I go into the paint. I'm going to make sure that my brush is nice and dry. I'm going to use a paper towel that I have hidden right here. And I'm going to go right into this yellow. You probably won't be able to see the yellow, but I'm just going to do that, and I'm going to make marks, okay? And that's a dry brush technique. So I'm going to actually use a different color so you can see it. Maybe I'll use that green, yellow, that yellow green that I mixed up before. And then, so you can see that you have a lot more control over the marks when you're using a dry brush. Okay, so you can almost, like when you use a dry brush, you can almost use it as a pencil. Okay, so I can get a really nice fine line when I use a dry brush. Okay, so that's the really cool thing about dry brush. Okay, lift off. We have lift off. So lift off is I'm going to create a wash on the paper, and I'm going to let it dry. So while it dries, I'm going to go back to our transparency. So I'm going to use let's do a yellow orange. We haven't done that yet. And I have some yellow pigment there that I want to use. So I'm going to mix up some more yellow. There. And then dirty water, clean water, some orange. Ooh, got a lot more orange in that than I thought, but that's okay. Okay, and I'm gonna put a lot more clean water into that, and I'm not touching my brush to the paint. I'm just dripping the water in there so I don't have to clean my brush again in the dirty water. Look at how I got that really nice wash. How wonderful is that? So I'm just gonna paint this area. Sometimes this technique doesn't work as well on drawing paper because drawing paper really absorbs the paint. So we'll see, we'll find out. All right, so pen and ink. I'm just gonna do a simple design. Don't worry, you can do more intricate design if you want to do that. I always, whenever I want to do a design, I always go back to a spiral. I don't know why. I got kind of obsessed with spirals when I was in college. And one of my favorite things to do is to do like patterns inside spirals. I continue to do this even in faculty meetings. Don't tell Miss Hatswell. Okay, and I'm not gonna make you watch all of this. Okay, so do a design using pen and ink, and simply with pen and ink, after you have used a permanent marker, make sure it is permanent. If it's not permanent, it's going to bleed. You're gonna go and just fill it in like you would a coloring book. Okay, so and I can do it with different colors. I can put that red right there. And I think it might be a little bit difficult to see on that camera, but I'm just filling in the color. Okay, I might make it darker in a couple areas. Okay. But I'll alternate it, and I'm kind of using a wet brush. I'm not using a dry brush, but if I wanted more control, I would use a dry brush to really go in there and make sure that I'm really taking my time with filling in those spaces. And I can even do a different color around those circles that I created there. And when you're doing this, you can experiment with using a wet brush, using a dry brush, seeing what is easiest for you or what a technique you like. So, and you just fill in that space. Okay. And watercolor, there's just so many things to do with watercolor. It's amazing. All right, so as things are drying, okay, so my transparency is dry, so now I can go back to it. So for the transparency, I'm gonna go over those green shapes with my blue wash that I created, and I'm actually gonna put more pigment to this just because I felt like it needed more. I'm actually gonna put a little bit more water to it. Okay. And now I'm going to do the shape right over that shape I did. And once it dries, you will actually be able to see the shape through it. And it might be a little harder to see on this camera, but once it dries, you should be able to see it pretty well. This one's probably going to be a little bit easier to see. Okay, so you can see how it's poking through. You can see the transparency. And the reason why you are able to do that is because the other color dried, right? So you are able to put a color right on top of it and you can see right through it, okay? So if I wanted it to be even more transparent, I'd add more water. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'm going to add more water to my wash here. Okay. And when I do that, you'll see that you'll be able to see even more the transparency of the shapes. Okay, so you can really control how you see the transparency by the amount of water that you use. All right. So the next one that we needed to wait to dry, it's still a little wet, so we're gonna wait just a little bit longer. So masking tape. So again, if you don't have any painter's tape, I'm using painter's tape. If you don't have any painter's tape or masking tape, don't worry about it. You can skip this one for your assignment, but I wanted to show you that this is a technique. This is a good way for if you want to do trees or lines or a straight line or whatever you want to do. Using masking tape to mask the paper from the color is a fantastic technique and a fantastic application trick. So I'm gonna use my red again. I haven't used green in it. Let's do some green since it's, since I've told you it's my favorite and I haven't used it a lot. I've actually really been proud of myself that it was not the first one I keep going to. All right, so I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to go right over the masking tape. Okay. And you can do a more intricate design if you really want to, if you have masking tape at home to do this, to try this technique out. But this is just for a fast, and I'm actually just going to do a line on that one so you can see how wonderful that straight line comes out. Okay, so let's see. It's still pretty wet. All right. So as you can see, all these techniques, so I'm going to actually have to wait for that to dry as well. I'm going to wait for that to dry and we'll be back. Okay, so now that it is dry, I am going to use clean water. And I'm going to take my brush and we're going to see if it works. Like I said, drawing paper tends to absorb the paint a lot more, and yeah, it's not really working. But if you had watercolor paper, you can add water to it and it will draw up the paint. Okay, so we'll call that one a wash. Oh, I cracked myself up. But I wanted you to know that if it was watercolor paper, you can actually lift the color off the paper by using water to even it out. It was almost like what we did up at the graded wash. Okay, so now I'm going to take off the tape so you can see how that tape creates those lines and keeps things nice and crisp. Look how beautiful that is. All right, and even the most basic design can look a little more interesting because of masking. And there's different ways to do masking. There's masking tape, there's cement glue, and you can also use what's called liquid mask. So those are all things that if you want to look into, you can. All right, so we're going to move on to our next section, which is Watercolor Texture Techniques. So what we did was just application techniques, now we're going to do texture techniques. Okay, so I divided my paper up again in 8 sections, and most of these are, you can, if it uses a item, it is a household item. So we have salt, rice, paper towel, water drops, splatter, and then the last 2 are rubbing alcohol and sgraffito. Rubbing alcohol, especially right now with COVID, is kind of hard to find, but if you have some in the house, this is a fun technique to work with. If you don't have any, don't worry about it, don't do it. And then for sgraffito, you need something sharp to draw into the paper. I actually went into my utensils drawer and I found a corn on the cob holder, right? It has a little sharp edge to it, and so I'm going to use that. If you can't find something that has a sharp edge to it, or your parents don't want you using something like that in the household, and you don't have like a paper clip or a push pin, you can skip this one as well. Okay, so I have a containers of salt, table salt. That's all you need is table salt. And then I filled up a coffee filter of rice, so I have that on hand. And then I have a little bit of rubbing alcohol in this dish here. So I also have my paper towel on hand, so I'm all ready to go. I have my paper sectioned out and labeled, and so now I'm going to get going. So with the salt, what we're going to do is I'm going to put a really nice wet wash down. I also got clean water, so make sure if you haven't cleaned your water, you do that, because you're going to want clean water for this. So I'm going to make more of a green wash. Okay, and I'm going to really get more. I want a lot of water with these texture techniques. Okay, so I'm just, all right. So now I'm going to get a nice wash down with this pigment. Okay, I really need to get the area saturated, so I could have done a wet on wet, and that would have really saturated the area. And now I'm just going to take that salt while it is still wet and sprinkle a good generous amount on it. And I'm going to let that dry like that. And then once it dries, I'm going to come back and I'm going to wipe that salt off. Okay, so for the rice, I'm going to do the wet on wet technique. So I'm going to really saturate my paper first before I put a wash down, because with the rice and the salt, you really want a saturated area of the paper. Okay, so I'm really getting that nice and saturated before I get going. I'm going to use my blue pigment and get that area nice and saturated with the pigment. Okay, and now I'm going to use my rice, and again, I'm going to let it dry there. This is another technique that if the paper's not just right, it might not work, so we'll find out. Alright, so now, oops, I'm going to get another wash going with paper towel, and so I want a darker pigment for this one, so I'm going to put more red in this one. Alright, and I'm going to put a wash down, and as it is still wet, you can do a couple things with the paper towel. You can blot it like this to get a nice texture, and it's kind of hard to see on this video, or you take the paper towel and you let it dry on it, like you just like place it there and you let it absorb. Again, this drawing paper does absorb a lot, so a lot of these, so this one didn't show up as much, but that's okay. Okay, so now I'm gonna go on to my water drops. So I'm gonna use my blue. I'm gonna actually mix these together now. Now, I wouldn't normally do this, but I want to use like this blue. I love blue-green. Love blue-green, but I wanted to make a blue-green, and I'll clean that up later. So I'm going to put a nice wash down, and as it is still wet, I'm going to use water, and I'm going to put drops on it. Okay, sometimes you need to really push the drop down on it, and what you'll find is that it starts to spread. Okay, this video is not showing up very well on the texture, but I hope you can see the texture once you do it. Okay, splatter. Splatter is exactly how it sounds. You're going to take some color, move this over for you guys to see. Okay, for splatter, I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to put it in a pigment. Be careful with this, especially at home or not in the art room. The art room, you can be a little bit more splattery, but you're at home. Don't get your mom mad at me. Take your paintbrush like this and tap it. Okay, and that's a splatter. Notice it splashes other places, so be careful when you do the splatter. Have fun with this one though too. Try different colors. But again, don't get your mom mad at me. I don't want to get phone calls that it's all over your bedroom. I'm gonna get phone calls, what did you teach my child to do? So make sure you paint responsibly, right? Okay, and I also recommend that if you're doing this on a painting, that you shield the area that you want to have paint on it. So you can put paper on either side, you can put tape, whatever it is, but splatter's a lot of fun. Okay, so now rubbing alcohol. So I'm gonna make a red-orange. Ooh, yeah, that's pretty. All right, so now I'm going to put the wash right down on it. I'm going to clean the brush real quick. While it's still wet, I'm going to dip my brush right into the rubbing alcohol, and you'll start seeing how the rubbing alcohol spreads the paint. This drawing paper really doesn't do it justice, but usually especially with watercolor paper, because it doesn't absorb so fast, it really does a nice spread, okay? You can also experiment by using different colors in your rubbing alcohol, so to get those techniques. Sgraffito. You're going to, so sgraffito means to scratch in Italian. So I'm going to, on dry paper, make some marks. Oops, I'm kind of scratching the paper out. I'm gonna make some marks, and then right over that, I'm gonna wash off my paintbrush. And then I'm gonna use this one again, and you can see this one's the most successful on this drawing paper. You can see as I'm doing the wash, the areas that were scratched will take in more pigment, which will make it darker. So it's kind of a cool technique. Okay, so like I said, the rubbing alcohol and the water drops are usually a little bit more and the paper towel. We'll see if the salt and the rice did well on this paper, but it might not have, and that's okay. That's what happens when we do art. Sometimes it doesn't work out. So I'm going to take the rice off, and it really didn't do all that much. The salt did great though. So I'm just taking the salt off. As you can see, where the salt was is a lot darker. So the salt's completely off now, and you can see that it is a lot darker where the salt was. And if it was, there you go. And now you can kind of see that texture in there. So the paper towel, the watercolor, and the water drops and the rubbing alcohol was not as successful on this paper. So that's a bummer, but it's okay. It is what it is. Okay, so since the drawing paper didn't work so well, I decided to, I had some watercolor paper. So I did this real quick where I did some rice, some rubbing alcohol, water drops, and I used pigment on pigment, so I used color on color. So I did a yellow wash, and then I did red water drops, and so you can kind of see that kind of a tie-dye look to it. And then paper towel, you can actually start seeing the texture in the paper towel when I just patted it down. So paper does matter, but if you only have drawing paper, don't worry about it. Don't go and buy new watercolor paper. You won't need it for the watercolor assignment. And then I kind of wiped off the rice a little too soon, but you can kind of see the texture in there that it creates. But if you do have watercolor paper, this is fun to work with. But again, don't go out and buy some if you don't have it. It's really okay if it doesn't work. That's why I'm showing you the things that don't work too, because sometimes things just don't work out, and that's okay. All right. So Okay, so to clean up, there's a couple things you can do to clean up. If these are colors that you are going to come back to and work with, you can let them dry, but let them dry open like this, okay? If this is your palette and you're going to come back to it, let it dry like this. But if you are not going to use these colors again, get some paper towel, get clean water, which I have over here, okay? And clean up your palette. All right. The clean water helps just kind of mop it up a little bit. And then I'm also going to use a dry paper towel. Clean it, to just wipe up after what I just did. And when you get more advanced in your watercolor, you're going to keep colors in the same area. You're going to keep cool colors in one area and warm colors in the other area. But you have that cleaned up. Look how nice that is. It's super easy. I didn't have to go to the sink. I used my clean water, dipped it with paper towel, just wiped it up, okay? So I'm going to close this up. My paintbrush, I can use a little bit of clean water. When you are cleaning a paintbrush, you want to make sure that you dry it off by going the same direction as the bristles. You don't want to ruin it. You don't want to give the paintbrush what I call bedhead. You don't want that. So you want to make sure the bristles go in the one direction. You can also, when it starts getting really dirty, you can take it to the sink with some mild soap and some water in your palm and just go like this under the water, and that will clean your brush really nice. So then you're going to close it up. I'm going to put the brush back in there. I'm going to close it up, and I'm going to make sure that I do not jostle this around, because though this is clean, this is still wet, and I don't want that to make a mess. So I'm going to close that up, and I'm going to clear my space. So I'm going to take my water, dump it out. I'm going to take my salt and all the other items, and I'm going to dump them out the proper way. I'm going to clean up my space. Make sure you clean up your space because, again, I don't want to hear from your mama that you're not cleaning up after yourselves, okay? So I want you to do these techniques. I want you to have fun with it. Really explore what watercolor can do. The world of watercolor is fascinating and fun. I'll see you guys later.